Before I get to the serious stuff, I have a few remarks. First, as you can see, I have slightly changed my title, so I added two authors, Coghill and Rizal. I'll be talking about how Merleau-Ponty interprets those three guys. I have opted for a slightly different form. I have a written text. I realize that it can be a bit more demanding for you to follow, but I have also extracted the main arguments and I have them in the PowerPoint, so hopefully this will be okay for you. If you cannot follow, please stop me or give me some. I have good reasons for working like this, and it relates, or those reasons relate to the material I'm using. I'm using not published works or not books published by Merleau-Ponty or papers. I'm using basically working notes or the records or the notes recorded by his audience. So this is very often very fragmentary, unsettled material, and there is a lot of interpretation involved and a lot of kind of organization from my part, right? So there's a lot of kind of reconstruction there, and also the arguments that I'm trying to follow in Merleau-Ponty are quite convoluted, so it's not a settled thing. So that's why I prefer to stick with a written text, because this allows me to keep track of the very precise formulations and some of the details in the paths of the arguments. And the second note I wanted to have is related to what I have heard Sean Gallagher saying recently in a conference where also Sebastian was present. That was just 3 weeks ago, I think, in Budapest. In the discussion, Sean Gallagher said, well, in those lectures on nature where he is interpreting Coghill and Gazelle to embryologists, Merleau-Ponty came to the edge of discovering autopoiesis. Have you heard? Yeah. And that was the first time I heard this, anybody say, and that's quite interesting, to me at least. So I offer this to you as a way also how to read my presentation. Okay? And there was another remark made by Sean Gallagher, and that was the autonomy is not absolute, of course. So I'm trying to combine these two remarks in my presentation by coming back to Merleau-Ponty. And then if you don't like my presentation, please refer to Gallagher, who is speaking exactly about the same topic, so about Coghill, Gazelle, as read by Merleau-Ponty, in just, I think, a couple of weeks in within the Merleau-Ponty Circle Conference in Australia. So you may compare. Okay, I don't know what he's going to say there, but you'll see. You can see if you're interested. Okay. Okay, I'll explain later a bit more about what kind of sources I'm using. I'll start by the lectures on institution from 1954 and 1955 by Merleau-Ponty. So in these lectures, Merleau-Ponty contends that the birth of a living being is an instituting event. What he means by that is that birth is not merely a constituted result of an ordinary constituting act of some vital force or a third-person process, but rather a fruitful event, thanks to which a sense is deposited in the living being as something to continue, to complete, without it being the case that its sequel is determined. In other words, for Merleau-Ponty, birth establishes a system of references in relation to which a whole series of events and experiences will make sense and will make a sequel a history. In the lectures on nature and elsewhere, Merleau-Ponty contrasts his view of organisms with mechanistic and vitalist theories of life, arguing that life is neither chance nor entelechy. On the one hand, the development of an organism is not merely a cumulative sum of physical-chemical processes. Rather, there exists an internal relation of the meaning of the organism's different phases. On the other hand, there is never pure finality within the organism. a vital force or an essence of the species that predetermines its temporal development. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that development is never absolutely given with the internal innate structure. Within certain limits, the form of the organism is flexible and responsible to specific spatio-temporal conditions. From this perspective, a living organism is essentially a tradition or a continuum that persists through situational fluctuations. However, according to Merleau-Ponty, life does not just maintain coherence across space and time, it is a continuum of antecedents and follow-ups. In other words, life anticipates the relevance of concrete configurations of facts that do not yet exist, and conversely, it retroactively incorporates facts encountered, so to say, prematurely at earlier stages. As such, the development involves an elaboration or a working out of a spatial schema and temporal schedule preliminarily established at early stages. This mode of existence makes it possible for the organism to integrate even accidental events, thereby giving meaning to facts that it could not foresee. At each moment of its history, the organism is an emptiness which will be filled later. In short, life is inherently problematic. Il y a des problèmes dans la vie, as Merleau-Ponty writes. It involves a factor of disorder, which it must continuously counteract within concrete historical situations, while never possessing a principle of successful coping in advance. For these reasons, life's development follows a certain direction, enabling a competent observer to identify anticipations, reminiscences, and an inherent continuity among them. Merleau-Ponty acknowledges that development encompasses aspects traditionally described as innate, physiological, internal, and individual, as well as learned, psychological, external, and social, but he argues that it is always situated below and above all of these characteristics, and is reducible to their sum. Furthermore, he notes that in attempting to observe the development, we are always either too early or too late. According to Merleau-Ponty, life is a macro phenomenon that requires comprehension through the global logic connecting its isolable elements, despite this logic never being given separately or in advance. As Merleau-Ponty also writes, understanding organism requires the observer to live alongside it as it unfolds in time and progressively takes possession of its body and its environment. In the subsequent parts of this presentation, my objective is to examine Merleau-Ponty's integration of the historicity and plasticity of organism and elucidate its implication for the ontological status of organic wholes. First, I'll provide an overview of Merleau-Ponty's exploration of Coghill and Gesell, their research on embryogenesis. And in this section, I will focus on the recognition that comprehending organic development necessitates acknowledging a structural interplay between anatomy and behavior. This dynamic interaction demonstrates how early behaviors and anatomical structures influence and anticipate future developments and vice versa. In the second step, I will investigate the ramifications of this analysis for the ontological status of organic wholes, and I will analyze Merleau-Ponty's proposition that the gap between the whole and its parts is bridged, albeit not closed, through the engagement of an empathetic observer. In the brief passages from the lectures on institution, exploring the institution of life, or animal institution, as Merleau-Ponty writes, draw extensively from Raymond Rouillar's paper on, by then contemporary theories of animal instinct. Rouillar presents studies by Lawrence, Steenbergen, and Gesell, specifically focusing on imprinting in birds and embryonic development. Later, in the second year of the lectures on nature, Merleau-Ponty further explores these themes by directly analyzing the authors cited by Rea, particularly interpreting Coghill's study of the embryonic development of the axolotl lizard and Gazelle's research on human embryology. Merleau-Ponty delves into Coghill's study of the axolotl, a North American reptile, which undergoes significant anatomical and behavioral transformations throughout its development. Initially resembling a tadpole and living in water, the axolotl goes through 5 stages, progressing from immobility to partial mobility and eventually acquiring the ability to swim. Finally, it grows 4 legs and transitions to life on the surface, terrestrial life. Coghill argues that understanding anatomical observations at each stage requires considering the animal's future capabilities rather than merely perceiving it as functional mechanism. This shift from a static to dynamic anatomy, as he calls it, appreciates behavior as an indicator of subsequent anatomical development. Merleau-Ponty then highlights how Gazelle revisited Coghill's ideas in his research on human embryogenesis. Gazelle also emphasizes that an animal is more than a machine, pointing out that early anatomical development anticipates future behaviors. Both Coghill and Gazelle challenge the idea that the function follows organ or that organ follows function, or both of these ideas, asserting the interplay between anatomy and behavior as mutual antecedents and reminiscences. These insights lead Merleau-Ponty to consider the relationship between the parts and the whole of an animal, as well as the temporal aspects of their interaction. I will first take a closer look on the relationships between parts and the whole, or the materials and the form of the animal, and then on the temporal aspects of their interaction. So, from a bottom-up perspective, an organism's development is heavily influenced by its constituent parts, contributing to the formation of its body. The organism's behavior is, of course, intricately linked to its growth and the accumulation of physicochemical materials constituting its body throughout various developmental stages. As the organism grows, changes occur in the arrangement of these materials, affecting its behavioral capabilities. And here I'm just summarizing what Merleau-Ponty takes from Coghill. Coghill highlights that there are what he calls pre-neural gradients, which envelop the functioning of the nervous system. These gradients can be understood as, or they represent various types of differences in sensitivity to stimuli in different tissues. These gradients serve, according to Coghill, as material precursors to future nervous connections. Coghill suggests that even in mature organisms, these pre-neural dynamics continue to influence the nervous system and thereby contribute to their capacity to learn new behaviors. This view implies that the behavior is not solely dictated by the anatomical machinery at a particular developmental stage, but rather evolves from the organism's specific physicochemical properties. Of course, there is also a top-down perspective. So, conversely, anatomical maturation and associated behaviors appear pre-adapted to environmental needs, providing advantages to the organism. For instance, in the case of the axolotl lizard, maturation leads it to a transition from one adapted behavior, swimming, to another, quite differently organized, walking. This shift in behavior demonstrates the gradual extension of the whole organism's behavior to its periphery, according to Coghill and Merleau-Ponty. This process does not involve assembling the organism piece by piece, but rather accumulating materials and structuring them anatomically and functionally according to a holistic pattern, thereby ensuring the unity of the organism's body and its capacity to make sense of its environment. Merleau-Ponty's synthesis of these two perspectives leads to his assertion that the animal, rather than being a machine from the outset, becomes increasingly machine-like as its existence progressively articulates pre-anatomical materials into anatomically and functionally distinct units during embryogenesis. Ponty argues that the organism unfolds progressively, making itself more machine-like through internal differentiation. So, for Merleau-Ponty, Coghill's insights highlight the reciprocal relationship between the local spatio-temporal conditions, material determining an organism's body, and the global pattern of its existence. This mutual interaction reveals an irreducible gap between the organism's form and the materials composing its body. The global pattern never perfectly aligns with the actual organization of the body's materials, and physiological understanding is always redirected towards holistic considerations and vice versa. At this point, it is intriguing to observe then that in his lectures, Merleau-Ponty employs the term behavior to describe the concept of an organic whole, in contrast to anatomy, which refers to the material constituents of the organism. This choice of terminology might seem inadequate, as the organism is a physical entity, while behavior is a phenomenon that requires a subject to whom it appears. However, Merleau-Ponty's terminology, according to my interpretation at least, signifies a crucial shift in perspective, especially evident in how he connects Coghill's and Gazel's insights. Gazel's work helps Merleau-Ponty in elaborating Coghill's idea of the organism as a being that effectively spans the gap between its anatomical parts and its global pattern without closing this gap. Notably, Gazel argues that a living body is inseparable from postures, attitudes, or a range of gestures, all of which can be considered modes of motor action. For example, Gazel underscores that postural function relies on muscle tone, which is closely linked to basal metabolism, and hence represents the fundamental activity of the organism. The organism's action can therefore be considered postures and vice versa, irrespective of whether they involve actual physical movement. For Merleau-Ponty, this signifies the inseparability of the anatomical apparatus of a living organism from its behavior and vice versa. Merleau-Ponty succinctly captures this insight in the summary of his course on nature, where he emphasizes that animal being is already a doing, un faire. And conversely, there is an activity of the animal which is nothing but an extension of its being. In summary, with Gazel's insight into the connections between, on the one hand, bodily activities and postures, and on the other, physiological functioning and anatomical structure, the parts and the whole of the organism are no longer seen as mutually exclusive realities. Consequently, Merleau-Ponty concludes that behavior, often considered observer-related, and anatomy, traditionally seen as observer-independent, in fact possess a reciprocal character, as he writes. This conclusion opens a new perspective on the organism, indicating the gap between the parts and the whole is grounded in a dynamic behavior-anatomic continuum, which must itself be viewed as a structural dimension situated beyond the dichotomy of an objective thing and a subjective idea. Now, Merleau-Ponty also analyzes the interplay between anatomy and behavior from a temporal perspective. As I have outlined, during embryogenesis, one observes two levels of prefigurations and reminiscences occurring in parallel. Earlier behaviors serve as rudimentary forms of behaviors that will fully manifest in the future. And similarly, anatomical structures appearing at earlier stages anticipate fully developed structures that will emerge later. However, Merleau-Ponty's interpretation involves two additional symmetrical claims. Earlier behaviors anticipate future anatomy, and earlier anatomy anticipates future behavior. The temporal relationship between behaviors and anatomy considered in parallel becomes particularly evident in the transition of the axolotl from tadpole stage to the legged stage, and from swimming to walking. The tadpole's anatomy contains outlines of structures that will be used for walking in the future, even though these outlines are integrated into swimming movements during the tadpole stage. For instance, during the tadpole stage, nervous fibers develop in areas that will eventually form legs, when muscles and other tissues develop in these areas as well. This anticipates the future anatomical developments that will be needed for walking. So here, the anatomical apparatus has meaning only for the future, and the embryo is matter that refers to the future. Similarly, behavioral anticipations can be observed. When the tadpole's muscles are locally stimulated, it performs movements resembling the form and rhythm of swimming. This primitive response outlines the more complex behavior of swimming, for which the tadpole has not yet gained full control. In later stages, walking evolves as a functional elaboration of the undulatory movement of swimming, making swimming a rudimentary form of walking. Merleau-Ponty highlights similar dynamics described by Gazelle in his research on human embryo. Taken together, Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of Coquille and Gazelle underscores that behavior carries a reference to the future, extending beyond immediate possibilities and unable to immediately realize all it sketches out. As noted, however, the temporal relationships observed at the level of anatomy and behavior also imply that earlier anatomical stages refer to future behaviors, and vice versa. As Merleau-Ponty writes, anatomy is developed prematurely with respect to current possibilities of behavior, and behavior is ahead of functioning, holding a reference to the future. Hence, each stage of the organism's development is empty of what will follow and is more fully realized in the future. Merleau-Ponty interprets these facts as an essential incompleteness of life, characterized by factors such as indeterminacy, disorder, negativity, imbalance, or rupture of equilibrium, which are all terms that he uses in his lectures. However, Merleau-Ponty also highlights the positive value of this apparent incompleteness. The organism's underdetermination, in fact, creates a domain of signification in a temporal sense, where future events will make sense for the organism and provide concrete answers to questions posed by earlier stages of imbalance. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, the organism traces out what its future life will be. It contains a project in reference to the whole of its life, even if the concrete realization of this project is not foreseen by nature. Thus, the axolotl transfers the solution from the problem posited by its displacement in water to the problem posited by its displacement on land, yet by being transferred, the question changes and consequently the axolotl transforms itself from a swimming tadpole to a walking lizard. The earlier stages set the foundation for the future of the organism, but the future is required to provide provisional resolutions to earlier imbalances, ultimately transforming the organism from one stage to another. Merleau-Ponty's exploration of the interplay between physical-chemical materials and the holistic pattern of an animal's growth, where they interact without coinciding, prompts him to directly raise the question of the ontological status of the whole. Above all, he warns against two symmetrical errors, placing a positive principle, ideal as sense and telechy, behind the phenomena, and not seeing any regulative principle at all. Although he underscores the fundamental importance of the question of organic wholes, he differs providing a definitive answer to the end of these courses, as he puts it, and in fact, he never directly addresses it. So in this section of my presentation, my objective is to outline Merleau-Ponty's position. And I will do that by integrating his insights from the lectures on nature and other working units. The primary challenge here is in how to reconcile two distinct sets of Merleau-Ponty's remarks, one set suggests that organic wholes exist independently of the observer, and the other set of remarks maintains that there is a specific relationship to the observer. After introducing, this is an interesting point of his lectures on nature, because after introducing the questions of the ontological status of the wholes, Merleau-Ponty shifts to perceived wholes. This is very surprising because a return to perception could reduce, or there's a danger that we could start reducing the holistic quality of organic forms to a mere reflection of the observer's anthropomorphic experiences with the organism. Unfortunately, Merleau-Ponty doesn't provide a clear explanation of why a return to perception would specifically aid us in resolving the issue of organic wholes. He notes that there is a challenge of conceiving of organic wholes naturalistically, but holistic qualities become indisputable when we consider various forms as they are perceived. In other words, even if these forms are not necessarily explained as wholes from a naturalistic perspective, they are commonly perceived as such. For example, he provides several examples. I'll pick just one of them. He says that movement is perceived as a development that is directed somewhere to some final position, whereas physics strictly defines movement by its antecedents. Therefore, Merleau-Ponty's brief discussion of perceived wholes from the lectures on nature seems to be primarily intended to warn us against dismissing the holistic quality of the organic wholes in favor of reductive naturalistic explanations, and this discussion prompts us or encourages us that we carefully examine the phenomenal structure of the wholes. So, having shifted his attention to perceived wholes, Merleau-Ponty proceeds to summarize Albert Michotte's work, which sophisticatedly reveal the human inclination to perceive certain types of wholes as animal forms. However, before considering Michotte in detail, I would like to settle the question of whether Merleau-Ponty returns in his lectures on nature to transcendentalist position, which, according to some commentators, he defended at the end of his first book, The Structure of Behavior. In his synthetic interpretation of Guizot and Coquille, Merleau-Ponty, in fact, seems to lean towards the idea that the biological studies outlined above make us enter in being, or make us pass into things, rather than really informing us about the transcendental foundations of those who experience them. Merleau-Ponty notes, for instance, that it is not because we, as human observers, consider parts of the embryo appear as outlines of the organism's future anatomy that they are such outlines. Instead, they are outlines because they break the current balance and fix the conditions for the future balance within the organism. Consequently, life constitutes a history, a continuous sequence of anticipations and take-ups, not only for the human observer, but for the organism itself. When we witness embryonic development, Merleau-Ponty contends we are not witnessing a human history, but rather I don't have this one, but we are not witnessing a human history, but rather a natural history, as he writes. In his discussion of Driesch from the third year of the lectures on nature, he even underscores that there is a necessity of stripping the contributions by the human perceptual field from our vision of the animal and of the embryo. In these and similar remarks, Merleau-Ponty affirms his alignment with what could be called ontologically realistic, or at least non-subjectivistic interpretations of organic wholes. Behind you. It is evident that, on his view, with Coghill's, Gezal's, and Driesch's investigation into organic wholes, we are not merely interrogating the cognitive constitution of those who study and describe these organisms. However, it is crucial to note that Merleau-Ponty does not advocate a complete naturalization of organic wholes. He does not consider the organic wholes ontologically real entities. Merleau-Ponty consistently cautions against positing a perfection in the midst of becoming and interpreting the whole as a positive principle with an autonomous existence beyond the facts, as he puts it. This is evident when he explains that to read the axolotl's first movement, in the axolotl's first movement, the act of swimming, and to project what is yet to come into the past, amounts to a retrospective illusion. These observations primarily challenge vitalism, but they are equally relevant to endeavors attempting to confine the whole within physical-chemical nature. As noted, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that a gap persists between the factual existence of the organism and its entirety. Consequently, the holistic pattern influencing the organism's development cannot exert complete control over it. Instead, as Merleau-Ponty explains, the whole is efficacious or operant within the current state of the organism, merely a certain dimension, a dimension that is never fully determined. As previously discussed as well, the whole is operative within the organism as a system of references that is subject to specification from local spatio-temporal events. From this perspective, the efficacy of the whole never achieves a closure within the organism. If it were to attain such status, it would align precisely with how the materials within the organism are organized at a specific moment. However, as I tried to explain in the previous section, Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of Coghill and Gezel leads him to contradict such an output. Therefore, since the whole operates as an efficacious force within the organism without ever reaching complete determination, Merleau-Ponty doesn't regard it as an ontological real entity. While acknowledging that the whole exhibits certain observer-independent traits, he emphasizes the need for further clarification on how this organic whole, which is never completely determined from a physical-chemical standpoint, relates to the organism as it is presently observed. For instance, in the absence of a competent observer, the antecedents of current stages of the organism are efficacious within the organism as determinant of its current state, even if the organism does not itself perceive them as such antecedents. However, in the presence of a competent observer, these antecedents are also understood as relating to the currently presented form of the organism. In other words, the phenomenon of organic whole involves linking the presently observed reality to factors of organic development that, from a physical-chemical perspective, are either not yet in existence, no longer exist, or remain undetermined. The observer effectively completes, on a phenomenal level, what remains undetermined on the physical-chemical level. So, at this juncture, finally, Merleau-Ponty's interpretation of Michotte's work appears to be crucial. Although Merleau-Ponty's exploration of Michotte in the lectures on nature is very short and concise, he in fact draws on a much more elaborate body of work accomplished earlier. During his lectures from 1953, The Sensible World and the World of Expression, Ponty closely examined Michotte's experiments with stroboscopic projections that evoke the perception of organic wholes in the observer. The intriguing aspect of for Merleau-Ponty in these experiments is their illustration of our immediate tendency to experience specific perceptual figures as endowed with ipseity, or body, and a relational system geared into their surroundings. As Merleau-Ponty puts it, Michotte's experiments show that the appearance of a closed figure gives rise to the identification of my body with it, and Einfühlung, feeling into or empathy, of its relationship with the outside. For instance, in one of the experiments by Michotte, a series of highly abstract lines projected sequentially is perceived as the movement of a living creature, such as crawling or swimming, purely because the animation of these lines creates a perceived closure within the space. Following Michotte, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that this experience is not based on the act of mentally positing of the idea of an animal. During the experiment, the observer perceives movements of crawling or swimming without conscious awareness of any specific living organism, such as a worm or a frog. According to Merleau-Ponty, this experience solely relies on the perceptual organization of the figures and the way these figures modulate our body's motor intentionality, or more broadly, our inactive relationship with the environment. Merleau-Ponty argues that the elements of the perceptual field are comprehended as a spatial-temporal unity, or as a whole, only because the perceiver can control phenomenal transformations of space, or because they are geared into space as a system of the powers of their body. For example, one perceives movement, its sense, and its characteristic pace through motor possibilities of one's own body, Merleau-Ponty claims. Analogously, Merleau-Ponty contends that our perception of a figure as expressive of a living creature, which is anchored in its world, is fundamentally linked to the fact that we are ourselves anchored in the world. From this perspective, the possibility of perceiving life within organic wholes arises from the specific organization of these figures and how they interact with our bodily infrastructure. This interaction allows us to perceive their transformations as variations of our potential actions, thereby establishing our empathetic connections with them. In the final passages of his comments on Michotte from the Lectures on Nature, Ponty explicitly links the insights afforded by Michotte's experiments with Coquille's and Gazelle's description of the embryonic development of organic wholes. Ponty notes that in the global vision of the becoming of the embryo, there is the experience of the imminence of the future, the apparition of the center, as in Michotte's experiment, to which this or that could happen, the grasp of an ipseity. So, for Merleau-Ponty, the structural traits attributed to developing organisms by embryologists, such as their holistic quality, oriented development, temporal continuity, and the reciprocal relationships between parts and whole, attest to the presence of a perspective. Specifically, the holistic characteristics mentioned are accessible to us only through our own system of relations with the world, which provides a sort of framework for all the relations identified within the organisms. Ponty captures this insight in a later working note, in which he affirms that understanding an organism's relations with its environment and other organisms is possible through the mediation of our perception of the animal by borrowing from this field. Or, as he notes in the Lectures on Nature, every realist conception of nature is constructed by borrowing from the perceived thing from the universe of perception. It is important not to add to this that Merleau stresses that our empathetic relationship with other organisms is not hierarchical but lateral, as he puts it. He explains that we understand the animal body as a relation to an own world thanks to the perception of the animal body as ours, but he clarifies immediately that this is not to be understood as anthropologism because we are not the animal and the animal is not the perception that we have of it. Hence, when we perceive organic forms, we are not merely projecting our own relations with the world onto them. Instead, there is an intentional encroachment, as Ponty writes, borrowing from Husserl. Intentional encroachment between our relations and theirs, which leads to modifications in our inactive relations with the world. As Ponty also puts it, whenever we perceive a figure as a living being anchored in its surrounding, the figure has the ability to reciprocally modulate our own anchoring. So, to summarize, perceiving another living being's behavior enables me to recognize a specifically modified relationship with aspects of the world I myself interact with. As Ponty outlines in an unpublished working note from the last period, I never reach another living being at their origin, but I reach them at their horizon, as their inscription in the world. Or in other words, I access another living being as a living being, but by taking up its mode of behavior, thereby modifying my own behavior. I access the other organism's life through a sort of co-perception, where my perception of the world becomes mediated by the behavior of the organism. Sorry, I'm a bit late with this. So, to summarize, to conclude and summarize, Ponty's interpretation of embryological studies suggests that life cannot be comprehended from an ontological objective standpoint as a reality independent of any particular point of view. According to Ponty, encountering life involves a mode of participation because the observer's relationships to the world provide the framework within which a physical-chemically undetermined organism achieves sort of provisional phenomenal completeness. From this perspective, attempts to offer a naturalized account of organic wholes seem to overlook the inherent reference of life to such an empathizing observer. However, as I have attempted to clarify, for Ponty, this encounter with organic wholes is not subjective or reductively projective. Instead, it is rooted in an intrinsic connection between our living body, situated in the world and related to it, and other living bodies perceived within their respective relations, and dynamic articulations between these systems of relations. Thus, Ponty's interpretation of organic wholes as involving a reference to an observer does not represent a return to a transcendentalist position. Rather, it underscores that life is a relational phenomenon demanding an appropriate scale of description or a perspective that is neither too close nor too distant. Thank you.